Well, welcome everyone to the third and final installment of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire's final T. William and Patricia Ayers Global Tipping Point series of the year. We're very excited to wrap up these conversations on developing emerging economies, and very excited to hear from Dr. McKelway in a moment, and I'll introduce her, but I have a few things to get through first. Myself, I am Tim Horgan, for those who do not know. I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization dedicated to helping people better understand the world through a variety of different speakers programs, podcasts, international visitor exchanges, and high school diplomacy simulations. So we are centering ourselves at the forefront of global conversations, and we hope to be the platform for conversations that allow you to better understand the world and how you can play your role in shaping it. We are a community-supported organization, so thank you to all the members and donors in the room here with us tonight and those watching online as well. We really appreciate the support that you give in order to make this work possible. We also want to thank Southern New Hampshire University for providing the space. We've partnered with them for about 20 years now, and it's been a great relationship for us. Another great group that we've partnered with for many years is the New Hampshire Fulbright Association. So we really appreciate their sponsorship specifically of these series and the opportunity to work collaboratively with a great organization that shares sort of our mission. So Bill, if you want to come up and say a few words, I'll turn the mic to you.
Hi, I'm Willem DeVries. I'm president of the New Hampshire chapter of the Fulbright Association. Many of you will have heard my spiels before, so I'm going to change it up a bit. It seems clear that we are soon going to be entering a period of possibly radical changes in the foreign policies of the United States, one in which many of our alliances will be threatened under the name of putting America first. Now, I believe strongly that among the very most positive and effective tools by which we implement America's foreign policies, whatever they are our programs for cultural and scholarly exchange with other countries. The Fulbright program is, in fact, just one of them, but it has a very broad range and an incredibly high reputation around the world. So my plea to you tonight is to let your representatives in Congress, both in the House and in the Senate, know that you value these programs and that you urge them strongly to ensure that America's programs for cultural and scholarly exchange remain strong and free of undue political influence. If this issue does touch you, I encourage you to send me your email address or ask me afterwards, and I'll be happy to inform you when votes on these programs are due to come up in Congress so that you can time your emails, letters, or calls to your representatives when they can be most effective. So thank you. I think that's what I'd like to encourage you to do.
All right, thank you, Bill, for that, and for the longstanding support of the New Hampshire chapter of the Fulbright Association. We would also like to thank the Ayers family for their transformational gift that they provided to endow this series, and we really appreciate the lasting legacy that Patricia and T. Williams, Bill, have on this organization and our ability to host fascinating conversations like this. Final notes, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit, therefore anything said here tonight is the views of the speakers themselves, and the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire does not take any stances on politics, policies, politicians, my triple P. But we are really excited to hear from Dr. Madeline McKelway, an assistant professor of economics at Dartmouth College. She did her postdoctorate at Stanford's King Center for Global Development, got her PhD from MIT all the way back in 2020. We're really excited to hear more about your research into women's empowerment and employment, specifically with India, and what we can learn from that. So please.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you guys so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So today I'll be talking to you about some of my research, which is focused. So I'm an economist, and within economics, I focus on development economics and issues within developing countries related to gender and psychology. So I'll be telling you about some of that work tonight, but also trying to put it in the broader context of development and gender more broadly. So gender inequality tends to be higher in poorer countries than in wealthier ones on a lot of dimensions. So I'm going to show you a couple slides that all come from nice work by an economist named Seema Jayachandran. So each of these graphs is going to, on the x-axis is GDP per capita. So you should think of this as basically national income. So as you move to the right in this figure, you're going to countries that are wealthier. And then on the y-axis is some measure of gender inequality. Sorry. The y-axis is some measure of gender inequality. So as you go higher up, there's more gender inequality. So this figure in particular is showing you gender inequality in college enrollment rates. So you can see the trend tends to be downward sloping, so that in poorer countries in the world, there tends to be more inequality between men and women in college enrollment rates. Here's another dimension, which is attitudes about women in the workplace. So here on the y-axis is the fraction of people in a given country who agree that men make better business executives than women do. And as you can see, in poorer countries in the world, people are just much more likely to agree with that statement relative to wealthier countries. Here's another dimension, which is women's control within the household. So here on the y-axis is showing you the fraction of women in a given country that say that they have no say within their household when large decisions are made. The relationship is again downward sloping, not quite as strong as on the other dimensions, but there does indeed seem to be more inequality in this dimension in terms of control within the household in poorer countries relative to wealthier ones. So today I want to focus on one particular dimension of inequality, which is inequality in agency. So what do I mean by agency? It's basically the ability to control the course of your life. So it's the same sort of graph. Now we're looking at the male to female gap in respondents' agreement with the statement that they have freedom of choice and control over their lives. And again, we see a negative relationship here, meaning that in the poorer countries of the world, there's just a larger gap between men and women in the fraction of people who perceive that they have control over how the course of their life turns out. So why is there this gap in agency? Why do women tend to perceive to not have a lot of control over their lives in poorer countries? So one view, which is the much more standard view amongst economists, is that women in poor countries do in fact have less control over their lives because of external constraints that they face. So the first three graphs that I showed you are great examples of those. So women tend to have less education. That can give them less control over life. They tend to report having less control in the household. And they also tend to face these regressive gender norms in general. So these are all things that are external to individual women, that women growing up in poorer countries do actually face and could limit the extent to which they are able to exercise agency. Today I want to focus on an alternative view, which is, do women also face internal psychological constraints to exercising agency? So in other words, is there something within the mindsets of women who grow up in developing economies that keeps them from exercising agency? So the idea here is that they might just have a sense that they're not agents who are capable of acting on their desires and acting on their goals. And this belief could keep them from actually taking actions to reach their goals and thus keep them from exercising agency. So I want to say, yes?
Could you define agency again? I know you went over it quickly to get it, but I need to be refreshed.
Yeah, of course.
I'm not sure what you mean.
I mean the ability to control the course of your life.
Agency means the ability to control the course of my life.
Exactly.
You get to make the decisions in your own life.
Agency. That's the term you want to use.
Exactly. So, and here what the point is that, so women in poorer countries, there tend to be large gender gaps in poor countries between men and women saying they have control over how their life turns out. So the question here is why is that? One view is that women do in fact have less control over their lives because they face stronger gender norms in those countries, they have less education in those countries. An alternative view is that there's something about growing up in these countries that gives women a mindset that they are not able to control the course of their lives, and it's that mindset that keeps them from acting on what it is that they want. So today I'm going to explore this second psychological constraint view. I want to be clear, I'm not trying to say that the first view is wrong. I totally believe that these are all real constraints that women in poor countries face. This is just an alternative view, and I think that all of these constraints are probably at play. Okay, so I'm going to now be a little bit more precise about what I mean by this internal psychological constraint. And for this, I'm going to draw a concept from psychology called generalized self-efficacy, which I'll abbreviate throughout the talk to GSE. So what is GSE? It's basically an individual's beliefs in their ability to reach goals in life. You can think of GSE broadly as somebody's general sense of self-confidence. And if women have low GSE, for whatever reason, they have low self-confidence, they wouldn't pursue their goals, right? If you don't think you're gonna succeed in reaching your goals, you wouldn't pursue them. There are a number of reasons women might have these underconfident beliefs. It could be that growing up in a society with very strong regressive gender norms just gives you a low sense of self-confidence. It could also be because you've just never tried to reach your goals. So you've never tried, you don't actually know if you could succeed. And one really interesting idea here that I'll touch on, I won't explore too much in this talk, is that low GSE in a sense could be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you doubt your ability to reach a goal, you're not gonna pursue the goal. But if you don't pursue the goal, you don't learn that you could actually succeed in reaching the goal. And as a result, your self-confidence remains low. So the question that I set out to answer in the study that I'm about to tell you about is, does low GSE keep women from pursuing their goals? So this study was conducted in the state of Uttar Pradesh, India. It's a state in northern India. India, in general, has very high levels of gender inequality. Even within India, Uttar Pradesh has some of the highest levels of gender inequality. So this is a setting where inequality by gender is really, really large. So I worked in some rural villages in the eastern part of the state, and I enrolled about 1,000 women in the study. All of these women were aged 18 to 40 and married. So to make progress on this, so I'm someone who works with data, so of course to make progress on this question, we're gonna have to start by defining what we mean by goals and defining what we mean by GSE so that we can get data on it and try to look at the relationship between these two variables. So to start, me and my research team had qualitative discussions with women to try to identify the common goals that women in this setting hold, and also goals that are highly relevant for economic development. So some of the ones that come up are women would like to become employed outside of the home. Women want to give their kids a good education. And women want to raise the savings of their households. So these are all goals that, well, I won't say that every single woman in my sample held every single one of these goals. These are pretty common goals that a lot of women in this setting and in my sample would have held. And as I mentioned, these are all goals that are really highly relevant for economic development. So then we come up with, these are the 3 general goals. Of course, you're gonna have to come up with some way to measure whether women are reaching them. So for these, I'm gonna look at whether a woman was working outside of the home, whether her kids were attending school, studying outside of school, and whether her household was saving money. And then I basically aggregate these 3 into a single variable that reflects the number of economic goals that women were reaching. So that's how I'm gonna measure goals. Now, how am I going to measure GSE? So here, there are standardized scales in psychology to measure GSE. So we took a very common one, the Schweitzer-Jerusalem scale, and did some work to try to make the questions understandable in our context. And of course, we had to translate it to the local language, which is Hindi. So these are the 10 questions. Number 6 is a good example of the sort of question that was used to measure GSE. Can you solve most problems if you invest the necessary effort? So women were asked these 10 questions, and then I basically aggregate their responses into a single variable, which I call GSE. Okay, so in the data, it is true that women with higher GSE are reaching more goals. But that can't quite, remember the question I want to answer is low GSE constraining women from reaching their goals? That fact alone doesn't really answer the question because this is just a correlation and doesn't say anything about causality, right? So finding that women in my data who have more GSE reach their goals, it's certainly consistent with GSE leading women to pursue their goals, but it would also be consistent with reaching goals, increasing GSE, or consistent with some other variable, like education, that is positively correlated with both of these things and leads to there appearing to be a relationship between the two. So here what I do is I turn to the gold standard research design to try to pin down cause and effect, which is a randomized controlled trial. So what I did is I take my sample of 1,022 women and I randomly choose half of them to receive a psychosocial intervention designed to raise women's GSE. So what did that intervention look like? It was designed in partnership with an organization called World Being, which is a really neat organization that offers evidence-based programs in psychology in developing countries. So this intervention was delivered across 9 meetings to groups of about 6 women, all living in the same neighborhood. So these villages are set up where there are different clusters of households within the village. And so basically what I did is I took the women who had enrolled in my study within each neighborhood, and I formed groups of about 6 of them. And that was the unit at which this psychosocial intervention was delivered. So what actually happened in these 9 meetings? So broadly, the curriculum guided women to recognize how their abilities could enable them to reach their goals in life. So the early meetings discussed talents and character strengths and asked women to recognize their own talents and strengths. Then the meetings turned to discussing goals. So had women start thinking about what is a goal, what goals might I have in my life, and why is being goal-oriented matter. Then the meetings tried to help women see paths towards reaching their goals through planning or problem solving. And then the final meetings tied all of these pieces together, trying to guide women to recognize the talents and strengths they have that would enable them to reach goals they have in life. So this was a psychosocial intervention delivered across 9 meetings with these small groups of women. And the actual content was delivered in a variety of different ways. So there was instruction, group discussion, various activities in the curriculum. And throughout, it was really stressed that what women were learning was meant to apply to many areas throughout their lives. So it wasn't like, we were only talking throughout all of the meetings about their ability to take a job outside of the home. It was every meeting we talked about lots of different areas in life, so raising children, saving money, doing some sort of home improvement project, etc. Here's an example of one of the activities. So this was in the 6th session, and the activity was having women learn a skill of building plans towards reaching their goals. So they are given this worksheet, and at the top of the ladder, they had to draw something representing a goal they wanted to reach, and then at the various rungs of the ladder, draw the things representing different steps that they might follow to reach their goals. And the idea was that seeing everything laid out gives you more confidence that you could reach the goal. And laying things out in this way is a general skill that would help them reach other goals they might have in life. Okay, so in terms of the timeline and the data I collected around this, the intervention was delivered over 1 month back in 2017. And then the research team conducted surveys following the intervention to try to measure GSE and the economic goals. This was done through 5 different ways of surveys across the 1 year following the intervention. So we tracked these women through 2018. Okay, so now what were the results? What did I find? So before I try to turn to the main question of whether GSE leads women to reach economic goals, the first question I have to answer is a sort of sanity check, which is, did this intervention actually work to raise GSE? It's not an easy thing to do. This sort of intervention is not easy to pull off in the field. So it was a very real risk that you would deliver this intervention and in fact it doesn't have an effect. But fortunately it did. So this table is giving you the treatment effect on that aggregate of GSE that I told you about in the year following the treatment. So the way to read this is in the 1 year following the treatment, the average general self-efficacy of women who had been assigned the treatment was 0.18 standard deviations higher than the GSE of women who had been assigned in the control group. And given that treatment and control was assigned at random, you can interpret this as a causal effect. So the treatment caused GSE to go up by 0.186 standard deviations. The stars are denoting statistical significance, and so the fact that they're there means that this is a statistically significant effect. So now let's turn to the main question, which is, did this treatment empower women to reach their economic goals? And the answer seems to be yes. So here I'm showing you the same sort of result, except now I'm looking at effects on that index of various economic goals. So the index of working, children's education, and household savings. And so again, I find an effect here. And in terms of magnitudes, what this is saying is that across the year following the treatment, the average woman who had been assigned treatment had a goals index that was 0.124 standard deviations higher than the average woman in the control group.
Ask a question?
Yes.
So these metrics, like say household savings, do they self-report that to you saying, yeah, it's better, or do you have any sort of objective way to sort of validate, gee, that their account went up by 30% or something?
Great question. So it's all self-reported. For savings in particular, it's self-reported. And the way, we don't ask them about change, we ask them about levels. and then we can get the change by comparing the treatment and control group. So we say that particular question was, in the last 2 weeks, did your household contribute to savings? Now we do have a way to validate it, which is that we ask the same question to other members of their family. And we see that the reports, we also see effects on the reports of their family members, which gives us assurance that they're not just telling us they were saving money because they think that's what we want them to say. Yeah, of course.
What does the N mean?
Sample size.
Oh, okay.
So this is, it's basically an intersection of the number of women in the study times the number of endpoints I have for them. So this particular outcome was measured at 3 points following treatment, and there were 1,022 women who we tried to survey at each of those 3.
How many of those were controls?
Half, exactly half. Okay, so we saw that the treatment raised this economic index. It's a little bit hard to see what's going on once I've aggregated all of these things into a single variable, but I'll just tell you that we see modest positive effects on each of the different components of the index. Okay, so in conclusion, these results suggest that there are internal psychological constraints to women's agency. So I've shown you that a treatment designed to raise women's GSE made women more likely to reach their goals. So that suggests that low GSE keeps women from exerting agency by pursuing their goals. I won't tell you too much on this in this talk, but if you remember early on when I was introducing this concept, one really interesting aspect of it is this self-fulfilling prophecy nature, which sort of helps to answer the question of why is GSE low in the first place. And the idea is that it's low GSE is self-fulfilling. If you don't think you can reach your goals, you don't try, and therefore you never learn that you could succeed. So the evidence that I've shown you so far is evidence for this first step, that it's evidence showing that if you have low GSE, you don't pursue your economic goals. Oh yeah, question.
Follow up on this to see whether this effect was a result of the test that you gave, or was it sustained? Were they able to sustain this increase in GSE, or was this just a temporary effect as a result of people helping them out, making them important through the experiment?
Great question. So give me a couple bullets, and I will get there. The short answer is yes, that it did persist, and we tracked them for a year. So it persisted for at least a year. So in terms of a self-fulfilling prophecy, I've shown you evidence of the first step, that if you have low GSE, you wouldn't pursue your goals. The second step is that if you don't pursue your goals, you don't learn you can succeed. So in fact, I did a second stage experiment in this setting where I worked with a large carpet manufacturer trying to employ women, and among women who applied for the job, I randomized who got the job offer. And so that treatment increases GSE. So that's evidence of the second step, that if you succeed in the pursuit of your goals, your GSE goes up. So the other thing I find that's consistent with this self-fulfilling prophecy thing is that there's a GSE value above which women in my sample tend to accumulate more GSE over time, and below which the reverse is true. So that's consistent with there being a threshold for pursuing your goals, and if you're above that threshold, you would pursue your goals and succeed. And what I find is once I identify this threshold and then I look at how the effect of that GSE treatment I told you about, how it varies for people who would have been moved above the threshold by the treatment. And what I find consistent with this self-fulfilling prophecy idea is that the effect on the index of economic goals is entirely concentrated on the women who would have been bumped over this threshold. And then lastly, the effects of that GSE treatment are persistent for that group. So 1 year later, that group who would have been bumped up still are more likely to be reaching their goals and still have higher GSE. So in terms of the policy implication, these results suggest that empowering women by promoting their sense of agency could promote development. So remember, these things in these economic index are not just abstract variables that are going into some index. These are things that really matter for economic development: women's employment, children's education, and household savings. All right, that's it, and I'm looking forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
You can hang on to that mic. Well, thank you, Madeline. I know we'll have audience questions, so I'll give Larry a mic here. But Bill, if you want to start us off, go ahead. Here, I'll trade you, Larry. This one's on already.
Thank you. So that was a very interesting sort of conclusion, but the challenge of helping to raise GSE, looking at a country like India where you've got these cultural norms that are so deeply embedded over millennia probably. So how do you, I mean, the policy implication that you laid out makes sense, but implementing, I mean, what types of policies could be employed to move the needle given the cultural constraints?
Great question. So the way I did this intervention is not the cheapest way to do it. So I designed the intervention, and then I recruited a sample for the study, and then I trained, actually one thing about it that is cheap, which is pretty neat, is that the people who were delivering the intervention were not psychologists. They were lay people, they were surveyors. So in their normal course of work for me, they collect data and collect surveys, but we trained them to deliver this intervention, and they delivered it successfully. So what I did is cheap in the sense that I wasn't employing actual psychologists. What was expensive about it is that the meetings and the whole infrastructure to do this were set up just for this program. But there are a number of institutions within India that already aggregate women. So there are these things called self-help groups, which are like Roskas or microfinance organizations, and almost every village in India has them, sometimes has multiple of these groups, and women come together mainly to sort of act as a bank for each other. So they contribute money to a pot and then take loans out against that pot. But that congregation of women that already exists is one potential spot you could intervene in. You could, at pretty low cost, just add, and in a lot of states of India, the government actually facilitates those meetings. So it would be pretty low cost to just add on this training for government implementers to add there. And then the other place you could do it is in school. So a totally different age group, but you could work with like adolescents. And in fact, my partner organization, World Being, that's the group that they work with normally.
Chantal.
Hi.
Mike.
I have a very loud voice, but okay, I'll make
For
it.
the online audience so that they can
okay.
hear.
Okay. Hi, my name is Chantal. I'm faculty here at SNU, and I teach international affairs. And I do research in India as well on women who labor on construction sites in Mumbai and Navi Mumbai. So much of your research really resonated with what I was finding. I do extremely qualitative field work, sort of on the construction sites, all blah, blah, blah. I'm sure that all resonates for you. Let's see. I'm going to try and formulate a coherent question, but I'm sure you're going to have some really interesting insight into this. Before I even started in the field, when I was doing preliminary work and talking to folks who work in NGOs that work with construction workers, by the way, are a huge population of women work in construction in India. I just say that because most folks are completely surprised by that because it's not common in most other countries. It's very particular to South Asia. Anyway, they're also extremely marginalized, underpaid, undereducated, all the rest of that. Back to you. Before I started talking to my participants, I had folks who worked at NGOs telling me, you know, Chantal, don't look at agency in the ways that you're reading about it in all of the books on agency. And so I still grapple with this notion of what exactly is agency. And I'm wondering if you could just speak to that a little bit, because I imagine you have the same kind of tension with the models, the definitions don't exactly fit. I'll give you one specific example, and again, I'm sure you can speak to a lot of this. The women that I talk to, and I talk very, very long surveys and focus groups and all of that, they were very happy and willing to talk about their children, their hopes, their aspirations for their children, very mostly unwilling to talk about their hopes and aspirations for themselves. But it was almost like they saw their children as a part of themselves in such a way that we can't, in this cultural context, we can't even entirely get that. So, what did you do about all of that? Sorry, sorry if that's way too long.
Don't worry. So it's super.
But it is that complicated.
Yeah, it really is. It's amazing to hear about your research, by the way. That all sounds really exciting. Okay, so let me try to speak to maybe I'll start with the second part about the children and then come back to the first part about agency. I definitely experienced that in the same setting. So not the same setting, in a different setting within India, which is women love talking about their children. They don't have much to say about their own aspirations or their own hopes. And the way at least I interpreted that is that as a lack of agency. In other words, that in some sense, like the part of my intervention, one of the 9 sessions was spent only defining the concept of a goal to women. So in this setting, you go, like, the word translates and it exists in Hindi, but this concept that women might have something that they want to reach and they take the initiative to direct their efforts to reach it for themselves was totally foreign to women in this setting. So that was my read of this, is that the kids are basically in the setting I work, they're like women's entire lives. So women generally don't work outside of the home. They're generally restricted from physically leaving their home. And investing in their children is like their whole life, and they think about what they want for their children all the time. But the idea that they might have something that they want, it was a totally separate idea. In terms of defining agency, it's super, super complicated. So I went with this one definition involving self-efficacy, but even when you turn to psychology, there's self-efficacy, which is related to agency. There's also locus of control, which is a different concept in psychology, very closely related to self-efficacy, but not the same thing. And you could view it as agency. It's an equally plausible definition of agency. Then I come from economics, so within economics, when people talk about women's agency, they generally mean women's control within the household. And that's a totally separate notion. So the way I totally agree that what we mean by agency, there's not really a solid answer. And so the approach I took in this is just pick one notion of it and work with that notion, knowing that you're gonna miss some things because there are other dimensions of agency.
Do you think of coming up with a new definition? Sorry, I swear I won't ask a question, but sometimes I think that we just need a completely different definition based on cultural context. Based on cultural context, I do wonder if we need different definitions. Post-colonial scholars would make that argument, that we are just not defining it based on what women in those contexts think of it as. And so I'm just wondering if you've ever dreamt about coming up with your own definitions.
I'm quite intimidated by that field of that. I mean, I know how to run an experiment. I know how to run regressions. I know how to collect data. The idea of coming up with these new concepts is a little bit daunting. So I've never had aspirations to try to do that myself.
Well, we need to get your GSE up.
So instead, it's easier, I find, to just take it off the shelf. There is a really interesting work that was done in economics. So actually by the same author who had those graphs that I was showing you at the beginning, did this really interesting, so in economics, we're kind of obsessed with measurement because we're obsessed with data. And so this project was about how do you measure agency, and even aside to the question of how you define agency is complicated enough. Then if you go to economists and say, in your surveys, how do you measure agency? Then you just get, hundreds and hundreds of different survey questions that might measure it. So this paper had a really neat thing that they did, which is they sent people who had been trained in doing qualitative work. You would know better than I would what that means. Sent people who had been trained in doing qualitative work to have in-depth conversations with women to try to measure their agency in an objective sense. And then separately, they sent surveyors out to these women to administer the long battery of questions. And then they used machine learning to see which of those questions best predict the measure from the qualitative survey. It's pretty neat, and they come up with they have like 5 questions they recommend. And this is done in Haryana, I think, somewhere in northern India, but the other issue is that there's nothing to say that mapping would not change as you move to other parts of India. But yeah, it's really, of course.
Here, let's go up here first, Bill. Here. Sorry, Mike.
Thank you. Your approach targeted developing countries. It would seem that it might also apply to marginalized groups in developed countries. Would you think so?
Absolutely. And even non-marginal. I mean, a lot of these ideas would also apply to lots of people doubt their own abilities and have low self-confidence and make decisions in their lives as a result of that low self-confidence, when in fact they maybe could reach a goal if they tried. So yes, I think it's applicable in many settings.
So would you think of extending what you did to do something in developed countries or not?
It's a good question. I'm certainly not opposed to it. Certainly, like I find once you get going in a setting like India, you learn so much about the culture and the infrastructure of implementing these projects and doing the research that it's in some sense easier to continue working in the same setting and asking different sorts of questions. But if I found somebody who knew more about the institutions of doing work in developed countries, I would definitely not be at all opposed to doing it.
Well, it seems that this is a good starting point to then, go around the world. Maybe well-being has the capacity to do this work in other parts of the world as well. And you've proven for them, I'm sure they're very happy about that what they are doing actually makes an impact.
Yeah, and in fact, that's one of the goal of the work is that, you show that this policy has a particular impact, and then policymakers, whether it's the World Bank, whether it's World Being, whether it's other implementing partners, pick up the intervention and deliver it on their own in other settings. So yeah.
Let's go to Steve. Steve, hold on for the mic, just for our online audiences to hear.
Please and thank you.
Two quick things. When you use the word regressive, are you using that only from an economic perspective, like statistical regressions, or using it from a more social perspective, what's better or worse for women? And the second question, one thing that psychologists sometimes do research on with regard to self-efficacy is another concept called defensive pessimism. Did you encounter that at all?
Great question. So actually, yeah, what do you mean by defensive pessimism?
Well, I hoped you wouldn't ask that question. But I've seen it in studies that have been done on college students, particularly minority students, where they're not achieving their goals in part because they're pessimistic about being able to achieve those goals. whatever, whether they think the system's rigged or what. But this is not an area where I have any expertise.
So I also don't have expertise. What you described at least sounds very much like low self-efficacy. Like you don't think you have the ability to reach your goals. I'm sure that psychologists have come up with lots of interesting ramifications of this and different decision makings that might come of it. So no, I did not explore defensive pessimism, but the other thing to keep in mind is that when you do these interventions, there's a trade-off between doing something that can be rolled out at a large scale, so that, you know, developing a single curriculum that can be implemented by a non-specialist and rolled out to 500 women at the same time, is the things you have to do for that. You have to focus for the most part on just one big picture problem, like low self-efficacy. And even though psychologists have lots and lots of other interesting things you might explore, it's difficult to design an intervention that would really address all of those different things, especially if the person who is delivering it is not a trained psychologist.
And for the home audience, I just want to note that
On, Steve.
we were talking about the earlier question regarding regressive.
Yes.
You nodded your head that it was not simply economic.
Oh, yes. Okay, sorry. So regressive. So I used the word regressive, regression, two different senses. So the numbers that I was presenting you, those come from statistical regressions. Then separate from that, I referred to regressive gender attitudes. And by that, I don't want to take, there's so much work on this and it's really complex. Basically, I mean just more conservative gender attitudes. So in this setting, it would be like the attitudes that women shouldn't work outside of the home, men make better business executives than women do, et cetera.
Susan?
I had a couple of questions. When you reached your conclusions that showed that there was a cohort of women who were persistent in achieving their goals, did you also measure age? And were you able to say younger women were more successful at being persistent than older women, for example?
Oh, that's a great question. So in this, yes, I measure age. In this setting, in general, older women have more agency. So my strong suspicion is that if you were to just regress reaching economic goals on age, you would find something very positive, that older women are more likely to reach their goals. What I do not know is whether the treatment effect was stronger for older women or younger women. So I do not know that.
And with regard to the questions that you asked the women, were the responses yes, no, or were they on a scale, a sliding scale?
They were 4-point scale.
Okay. And then finally, did you get any pushback from husbands?
So in this study, so let's see. So there's definitely some pushback in letting women leave home to attend the meetings. The partner I work with is very, very good at designing culturally sensitive interventions. So to my knowledge, there were not any problems with what was being taught in the curriculum. It was more just getting women to have permission to leave home in the first place to attend these things. So was the problem.
Jim, and then we'll go to Bill and Bill. Over here, Larry.
What was the
It's on.
what was the general economic level and the general educational level of the particular area in which you were doing your studies, as opposed to the rest of India at that point in time?
Poor. So even relative to India, very poor. So this was rural, so in a lot of ways. So first we were working in Uttar Pradesh, which is one of the poorest states in India. Within Uttar Pradesh, we are working in rural eastern Uttar Pradesh, which is within that, an especially poor area. And then within that, the study was conducted only among the lower castes. So the wealthiest people we specifically sampled people from the poorer villages within their villages. So very poor. And in terms of education, also quite low. So I want to say about half of the women in my sample have 0 years of education.
Okay, can I follow up? Because you mentioned one word the first time you've mentioned it, the caste system. Talk to me about the caste system and how it impacted your work.
Great question. So it's very real. I don't know. So I should say there are lots of people who do research specifically on this. I'm not one of them. Where it mainly impacted my work in the sense of deciding which areas to target for the study. So I mentioned briefly at the end that I randomized this job. So that was done in partnership with a large carpet manufacturer. So we were only working in villages where they were going to expand their program for women anyway. And then within those villages, we specifically tried to target the poorer, needier people. So it mainly worked through the targeting of the sample. And then in terms of, there's all sorts of issues that come up in India around mixing of castes. You often hear about policies to try to integrate different castes, et cetera. But the way these villages work is that the neighborhoods are already caste segregated. So I wasn't doing anything to explicitly integrate the castes through this because the women came from women within their neighborhood, which are generally the same caste.
So you mentioned that many of the women, or most of them who were mothers, were extremely focused on their kids. And I wonder, in the case of women with low GSE, whether it's possible they were kind of transferring some of their own aspirations, which had been stymied in their own lives, onto their kids. And I was curious whether, if you think that's a possibility or a valid conclusion, do you have any observation on whether the mothers treated the boys differently versus the girls in terms of expectations and maybe promoting high GSE more toward boys than girls potentially, which would be a problem?
Very interesting question. So mothers definitely treat daughters and sons differently. So even in terms of aspiration. So on one of our surveys, we asked this question, like for every one of their children, we said, what level of education do you want this child to attend? And the level is much higher for boys than for girls. So it's definitely there's definitely a difference. We don't, in the data we collected, we're not really able to measure the children's GSE. So I can't really say more than that.
The first question I have is that I was a little bit worried or bothered because in your descriptions, you tended to talk very binarily. Agency, you got it or you don't. And that can't be right? I mean, there's people who have a good deal of agency, people who have very little, and there are people sort of in the middle. So is that just a function of expository simplicity that you did it that way?
Yes, for the most part, yes. The only part of the argument, and in fact, the way I measure GSE is continuous.
Right.
The only part where it potentially has to become binary is this idea of a trap. So because if where in theory where the trap originates is that there's a threshold level of self-confidence you have to have, and if you don't have that level, you don't pursue your goal. And if you do have the level, you do.
Or do you pursue your goal with a lot less effort?
Yes, so that's exactly. So that you could, so in the current version of the paper, for instance, that's the only part that is truly binary, but you could you could extend it, like you're saying, to have, different effort. As long as you have some nature of a threshold, you could get this trap idea.
Well, the other thing I wondered about, hearing what you said about agency and how difficult it is to define and measure that, is whether a really comprehensive look at this wouldn't treat agency as a vector, which has different dimensions, because there's some things in which I'm quite confident of my abilities. There are other things in which I'll avoid them, push them off on other people, because I have very little confidence in, for instance, dancing maybe. I wouldn't. And that might be a nice way to try to aggregate across several studies to think that there's a whole range of field of agencies, and that can make a big difference.
Yeah, so absolutely. So your question actually touches on, I sort of view it in two different ways. There's first this issue that we were talking about earlier, which is agency is not just GSE, right? Agency is like your bargaining power within the household, your locus of control, like all of these other things aside from GSE. But then even if you say, okay, let's focus on self-efficacy, even within self-efficacy, there's this notion of general self-efficacy, which is what I'm using. And so if you saw the questions, they're fully general. They're like, can you solve most problems if you invest the necessary effort, something like that. But there's a totally separate field of psychology that views self-efficacy as only domain-specific. So some people view it as, it doesn't make sense to talk about a general sense of self-efficacy. It only makes sense to talk about your self-efficacy in parenting, your self-efficacy in employment, your self-efficacy in all of these other things. So that's another choice that I had to make when designing the study, but that's, yes, another complication.
Do you have any?
Steve, hold on, wait for the mic, please.
Do you have any optimism that the results of this study might be of use to governmental agencies at the national or state level in India?
Yes. So actually, yes. And in fact, there has been, in the World Bank, for instance, they have these grants. I don't fully understand how it works, but they have these grants to offer adolescent empowerment programs for girls in a lot of different countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And so I know that they were interested in this and got in touch with my partner, Worldbeing, as a result of the results of this study. India specific, I'm not aware of at the moment, aside from the fact that my partner, Worldbeing, already works in India. And actually, yeah, so I think that's...
I did come across in my own research and preparation the U.S.-India Alliance for Women's Economic Empowerment. I don't know if you do any work with them or have any insights you could share on their work.
No, I do not work with them specifically, but I do know that this issue of women's empowerment and in particular women's employment in India has a lot of policy attention, even like not just alliances between US and India, but even within India.
All right, Chantal, we'll wrap up with you.
Is that okay? Yeah. Or, I don't want to steal the mic again. So you did, the research was 2017 to 2018, and you found that in terms of employment, that more of your participants actually were seeking employment or gaining employment in some way, shape, or form, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yes, with some caveats that get into, there are more complexities of this. There are a couple different treatment arms of the study that specifically aimed at employment given our partnership with the firm. So yes, given what I presented, but in fact, it's a little bit more complicated in the actual results.
All right.
But I can say about that. I can say more if you want.
We'll talk about the complications later. I'm actually curious if you were able to get at how much of the employment gains were due to this increase in GSE versus how much was it because they were actually being more forced into employment because of financial needs. So there was a lot going on in India at that time in terms of economic problems, shall we say. I mean, India was almost in what was considered a recession at the time. There was demonetization, I mean, all the stuff that you know about. So I'm just curious if you were able to disentangle, because all the women that I worked with were also scheduled caste, OBCs, I mean, same, very, very low caste, low education and all the rest of it, but they all worked. They had to. Whether their spouses wanted them to or not, they all worked. And so I'm just curious if there was economic necessity or if GSE was at play.
So that question I can't answer. The first question is a little more complicated. Happy to talk, of course, but that issue should be solved by the randomized design, right? So because I have a control group that was randomly selected, so on balance, the financial need is controlled for across the two.
All right, yeah, one more.
Do you have any plans or desires to go back and revisit and see if the women that were making progress are still making progress, especially after COVID?
So I am still doing projects in that setting. So we in fact launched a new experiment in that setting on Monday, and I was there in September and October getting ready for the new study. And we did, in between that, the one we're just starting and the one from 2017, we did another study, a separate topic. But so yes, absolutely, I am continuing to work in this setting. We have not planned, actually, as an accident of going back in September and October to work in the same setting, I happened to meet a woman who was in my treatment group for this study in 2017, and she still remembered, she still could like recite back, this was about setting goals and et cetera. But at the moment, I don't have any plans to specifically try to follow up with these people. But I'm still very much working in the same setting.
Okay, and I've got one question myself for you. I was reading a little bit about the study and was particularly interested in the finding that the women who did get work opportunities, it was a reduction of their leisure time, not the reduction of their household chores and obligations. Can you speak a little bit about that finding?
Yeah, so that's a companion paper to this one. So as I had alluded to, there was, I did a couple of cross-randomizations in this study. So cross-randomize basically means you randomize, let's say, somebody to GSE treatment or GSE control, and then within that, you do a separate randomization to another treatment. And so the other treatment, so what I was showing you was just the first branch. So anyone who got self-efficacy treatment, anyone who got self-efficacy control. But in fact, I did a second branch, which is I randomized whether their family members were shown this video promoting the new job opportunity with the carpet manufacturer. The idea being that the employment is a very particular goal in this setting because it's a goal that husbands and wives tend to have very different opinions about. So one of the challenges women face to becoming employed is that often their husbands just don't want them to become employed. And that's a little different than, husbands are not diametrically opposed to saving more money or educating their children. It's something particular to the employment goal. So that treatment, when it's given so among the women who got self-efficacy control, when you look in that subgroup and you look at this treatment of marketing this employment opportunity to their family members, it's highly effective at getting them to work outside of the home. And so then you can use that treatment to say, okay, you get women to work outside of the home, that working outside of the home comes with some cost, or it's a time cost, so where is the time substituted from? And it comes mostly from women's leisure. So that treatment significantly increases women's employment, significantly decreases the amount of time they spend on leisure, and does not significantly affect the time they spend on household chores. And by the way, women in this setting spend like 9 or 10 hours a day on household chores. because this is not a setting that they don't really have electricity, so they're doing all of this stuff by hand, and they have, lots of kids, farm animals, in-laws that they're all taking care of as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Madeline, for your insights, for your fascinating research, and I wish you luck in your new study as you build that out, and hope that this gets picked up for use around the world and can help in the efforts to better empower women and build economies. Thank you to everyone who joined us here today. We really appreciate it, despite the rainy weather. Thank you for making your way out, and thank you to everyone who watched online or watching the recording. We really appreciate your interest and support in helping to continue these conversations and shaping the world. So have a great evening, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event.
Thank you so much.